What do we call the spaces the city forgets? We often view vacant lots, industrial corridors, or even vast rural expanses as empty. But today, we challenge that definition. We explore the profound meaning and inherent value found in these overlooked landscapes, from the urban edgelands of Austin to the deep deserts of West Texas. We'll speak with author Christopher Brown, who dedicated 20 years to documenting and actively rewilding bits of unregulated space in the city. Then we'll hear from environmental humanities scholar Dr. Rebecca Potts, who studies the cultural conception and mythology of endless empty land in Texas. Join us as we explore what these spaces tell us about our relationship with the land and the meaning of emptiness in the Lone Star State. I'm Cheney Hill, an instructor at Rice University, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFD, Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Our first guest is out of Austin, Texas. Christopher Brown, author of Tropic of Kansas, is here to talk with us today about a natural history of empty lots. Brown approaches this work from a unique perspective, having previously written dystopian science fiction novels and practiced law. For over 2 decades, he has been captivated by the urban edgelands, those bits of unregulated space that exist in the in-between places of the city. So, Christopher, tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm Christopher Brown, author of A Natural History of Empty Lots, and I'm based up here in Austin, Texas.
So we're here to talk about your book, A Natural History of Empty Lots. My question that I want to start with is, how do you define empty lot, and what led you, someone who has historically written like science fiction and is also a lawyer, to dedicate 20 years to exploring, living in, and documenting the urban edgelands?
That's a great question. I think the simplest answer would be that I always have this urge to try to find my way into what feels more like real life than the sort of matrix-like simulation we often find ourselves living in. You know, I was sort of probably a bit of a nature nerd as a kid, but then, you know, in adolescence and young adulthood, I thought I had successfully, you know, moved away from that and was much more preoccupied with the world of books and urban life and cosmopolitan distractions. But then when I got into my I don't know, probably my early 30s, and I was a young parent and whatnot, and I started finding really strong attraction of, like, you know, going back to those sorts of places that I liked to explore as a kid, the sort of bits of unregulated space that exists in the interstices of the city. And so in the city was where you could still find that sort of sense of connection to real nature. So I started more actively, you know, as an adult, really like seeking out these spaces. And initially it was like the simple, you know, dad looking for something to do with his kid on a Saturday that was fun for both of us, right? Evolved in something a little bit more programmatic of, like, you know, seeing that there's something existentially enriching about getting into those sorts of unregulated spaces, those sorts of places where you could, you know, one, just sort of be free of the way the city is trying to tell you where to go at all times while making you think you're free. And then in a more, you know, sort of, you know, putatively transcendent way of, like, connecting to charismatic wild nature without leaving the city. And after a period of some years doing that, I got the idea that, like, oh, these kinds of places are so interesting and rewarding for me to explore. Might I be able to live in one? You know, could you like occupy that kind of a space, or cultivate in the confines of a normal sort of, you know, middle class American home and yard some of those same conditions? So I embarked on that sort of project and sort of rewilding the yard. And from that, I got into this territory of sort of trying to rewild the community, which is a bigger project and a sort of one that remains at a very early stage.
Mhm.
Rewilding is one of these words that's really kind of exploded in the last few years. I mean, it's been around as a concept for a couple of decades, but I just for folks who aren't familiar with that term, can you say a little bit about what you mean when you say rewilding and what that means to you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Weston. I think it's an important one because rewilding has, as a term, has a lot of different uses and connotations depending on who's talking about it. And including, in some circles, it's viewed as having roots in sort of eco-fascist ideas about sort of like, fantasies of compulsory depopulation and things like that. Uh, to me, rewilding simply means, it's talking about regulated and unregulated space, natural space within the city. It's about, at the most fundamental level, allowing other manifestations of life, other manifestations of nature other than human life to express itself freely in the land and in the environment and in a more intentional way, that's something more intentional than just like stop mowing and see what happens, right? Or, stop traveling through that space and see what happens is, active sort of so-called restoration, which I think is, again, it's kind of a packed term too, right? I think it's more like simulation of what you think might have been there. Maybe best to put it as simply actively seeking to generate more biodiversity than was there when you arrived, right? Bearing in mind that, and we talk a lot about the climate crisis. I don't think we talk as much about the biodiversity crisis. And, I mean, if you believe the World Wildlife Fund, according to their Living Planet report last year, the vertebrate wildlife population of the planet has plummeted by 73% since 1970, when I was like my daughter's age
Mm.
and, a little grade schooler. And even if the number is like half that, it's like a super sobering statistic. And I'm old enough, being a middle-aged American, to have like personally witnessed some of this, degradation of the sense of life around you. And so rewilding to me fundamentally, Weston, means trying to generate, to cultivate biodiversity in areas where
Mhm.
it's being decimated.
Yeah, and of course those numbers really only refer to the species that are known and cataloged, right? And we always have kind of preferences for which species that we're looking at, right? That's not to, mention all of the creepy crawlies that humans typically don't like, right? That we're not really looking into. But I want to, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting and like surprising, although I'm not sure why it was your articulation of the creation of your home. And I say that with some kind of awareness of how I'm framing that. So, in the conversation of rewilding and thinking about your home, which our listener audience doesn't know anything about yet, can you talk to us about the place that you have lived and that you've developed?
Yeah, so I talked about, the idea of trying to live in one of these, edgeland environments, to use Marion Short's charismatic term for these kinds of places that exist, sort of between the areas dominated by other human land uses in the city and where sometimes nature is allowed to express. And so, yeah, so I started looking around. I was like middle-aged bachelor looking around for a place to live, running an apartment downtown and doing all this exploring of different areas. And I found an empty lot along the Colorado River in on the east side of Austin. And what had been a neighborhood characterized by Jim Crow era industrial downzoning, a lot of
Mm.
kind of heavy industrial land uses below the Longhorn Dam, which is the dam that holds in the last of the Highland Lakes here in central Texas that were created, in the 1930s for flood control and nominally successful efforts at generating power. And so below that dam, it's kind of like the natural channel of the river. There's really no other major impediment between there and the Gulf. And so the industrial downzoning had this kind of accidental consequence of like keeping other human activity out of this corridor along the river behind it,
Mm.
kind of on both sides. And so there's this bountiful riparian kind of wilderness down there that once some of these, more noxious land uses stopped or moved further out of town, it rewilded on its own. And so I found this lot, but the lot itself was like typical kind of Texas, empty lot in a low income neighborhood at the edge of town. It was just like there was an abandoned petroleum pipeline running through it, very recently abandoned, like diagonally bisected the lot, because there had been an above ground petroleum storage tank farm, a couple of blocks away that had been a major kind of Superfund site, essentially a toxic site that, and it got shut down because a group of neighborhood activists managed to take on five of the majors and shut it down. And there was just huge quantities of like construction debris. You could tell as people had like, been demolishing buildings and roads and like building trucks up and just dumping the stuff on the land. And so I went over there with this realtor I know. It's this guy who like lived in my apartment building. And he's like, yeah, I can find some property over there. And he showed me like kind of a nice house that was nearby, and I was like, I can't, but this something about this crazy lot was both impossible and impossible not to do. So I set out to, I bought the lot. It was the depths of the financial crisis, and so the price was good. And turns out that large oil companies are happy to have you pay them to remove their environmental liabilities from your property. So I was able to get the pipeline out. And then I worked with some young and hungry architects to like implement my crazy ideas of how do you build a house that achieves this goal of generating rather than removing biodiversity from the site. And then this conceptual idea of like trying to harmonize this weird abrupt transition that existed in the context of this place between like a door factory on one side and a wind chime workshop and a bunch of like auto chop shops and a big dairy plant kind of, ambiently humming in the distance with its refrigerated tanks and whatnot. And then this kind of wild, rewilded woods and river corridor behind me, really radically conflicting environments kind of in this one place. So how do you like harmonize that? And so we built this house, which you can look it up. It's called Edgeland House for purposes of like the sort of ease of search. The house is tucked into, half buried in the ground, tucked into the ditch that was created by taking the pipeline out. And it's divided into two pavilions. So, like, to go from one room to the other, you literally have to step outside. It's small, the square footage, one of the design constraints is like, I don't want it to be any bigger than the apartment I was, renting at the time. And it's kind of almost invisible from the street because it's so buried, and then it sort of opens up to the river corridor. And then on the roof, we worked with our good friends who at the time were at the Wildflower Center, including John Hart Asher and his partners who developed a really effective way of making green roofs live and thrive in Texas. We essentially put a blackland prairie on our roof, and lo and behold, you put those plants in and all the other life comes. And after kind of one full season in, the experience was immediately like, almost utopian feeling, sort of butterflies flying around while you're having morning coffee and lizards skittling by. And we do get like, coral snakes by the bedroom door and other more kind of slightly scary Texas variants, and coyotes coming up to the back gate. But as an experiment in this idea of, creating biodiversity in your immediate domestic environment, it was kind of it's been astonishingly successful. It doesn't, not without its challenges here and there. Like keeping a green roof like that watertight is rather challenging, but if not impossible. But anyway.
I mentioned at the top of the show that you are a sci-fi writer as well as a lawyer,
Yeah.
and that your previous books at times are in the subgenre of like dystopian fiction. But
Yeah.
then you also just described your Edgeland home as being utopian. But some would describe, I think, the initial lot, which has this, petrochemical pipeline that's surrounded by all this industrial space. Some might describe that as like dystopian, or like what the future city might look like. So I'm just curious about that kind of intersection, and where your kind of experience as this dystopian writer was influenced by your home, or your home influenced your writing, or just the kind of entanglement of those things.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, my editor, the editor at Harper, who edited my three dystopian novels, he only half jokingly referred to these like nature writing experiments I had started doing on the side while I was working on those novels as like dystopian nature writing, and I was like, yeah, that's not a bad description. Very drawn to the power of dystopian speculative narrative because I think it gives you a toolkit for telling truths about the world that kind
Mm.
of conventional modes of realism cannot. Uh, Done right, it's a kind of mode of realism that is a kind of like a bent realism or a sort of funhouse mirror realism where you're sort of building your dystopia from the material of the observed world, but you're kind of adjusting the mixture of the things you choose to emphasize, right? And for me, the practice of doing that is all in service of a kind of utopian program of like looking soberly with clear eyes at the conditions of the world as it is, at all of the manifest injustices that you kind of take for granted in everyday life because it just becomes, you become habituated to it. Dystopian narrative modes let you kind of like shake the reader and hopefully yourself loose from that sort of habituation to like the things we take for granted as being okay. And so while I was working on my novel Tropic of Kansas, which I was really working on, in like 2013, 2014, and which came out in 2017. But so I had these characters wandering through this, funhouse mirrored landscape. And I kind of realized that them walking through that landscape, they were really walking through also the landscapes I was exploring on my own in a way. These very kind of, and, not just in Texas, but, kind of all over the center of the US, between here and the Midwest. And I started to realize like, oh, these social and political and economic injustices that I thought I was going to be focused on and that these characters are focused on, they're all inextricably tied up with the damaged relationship that people in this story have with the land on which they live in the same way that we do. After I turned in the last one of those novels, I started doing a kind of there's a weekly newsletter in the early days of Substack that sort of played around with this sort of just pure nature writing material, which was and I was intrigued by, and that led to this very different sort of narrative nonfiction, work, A Natural History of Empty Lot, which in a way is in conversation with all these other speculative, fictional literary works, and trying to kind of bite into the copper wire in a more direct and realistic way. In a way, I think I have found is, much more accessible to a wider array of people.
I can see the fingerprint of the sci-fi in this piece, in a lot of ways, and I mean that is like the truest compliment, right? Because it's not an easy thing to do, to write, a creative nonfiction piece that also appeals to that other side. When we were first kind of setting up this interview, or you mentioned that the petrochemical landscapes of Houston played an important role in this book, as well as one of the previous novels, which I think you may have alluded to a little bit, called Rule of Captures. I was wondering if you could talk more about the Gulf Coast and then Houston, kind of more specifically in relationship to your work.
Yeah, I moved down to Texas in the late 90s. Houston was like initially to me as a transplanted dork from Des Moines, just like profoundly scary. It was hot. It was like I would fly into Hobby and sort of drive up the, Gulf Coast freeway or whatever, and just this landscape of frontage roads and flare offs and, talk about dystopian. It was very intimidating in a weird way and really hard to kind of like just even like figure out how to access. But in time, the it really came to draw me in, and how many really interesting like ecological spaces are there that, I mean, it's kind of because the reason the petrochemical industry is there is partly because of the natural environment and the conditions that are there, and this same things that had drawn me to the place where I ended up, making my home. The ways in which industrial land uses can serve as zones of exclusion of other human activity that create these kinds of like weird, the world's grimmest and most unintentional wildlife preserves, right? There's a lot of that in Houston, and it's really interesting. So I was following the Center for Land Use Interpretation, and it turns out, in
Mm.
like right as I was following, they started this Houston field office, and they did this joint project with U of H to kind of like look at the petrochemical infrastructural landscape as like unintentional land art. And I dragged my then, middle school age son down to go like check out the exhibit. And, they were doing like, canoe trips up the ship channel and just, a lot of kind of crazy, to me, very interesting stuff. And really interesting, like mapping projects that showed, the ways that these natural landscapes and landscapes of extraction overlap or are one and the same, right? I was just really fascinated by that, and it had a big influence on my personal domestic project and on thinking about the material that led to this book. Houston is a place where Texan ways of like sort of loving the land and loving private property in equal measure and like this constant like trying to figure out how to reconcile those things and this like idea of just like the insane freedom of no zoning and the weird modes of self-expression it can afford. And Texas is really unique. There's like we don't have the same sort of shame-based, like euphemistic creation myth that people have in the other parts of the United States. In Texas, it's kind of like there's this story of conquest, and there's pride about it, right? It's just sort of and I think that in the kind of the economic culture of establishment Houston, that's like very manifest in a sort of button down kind of variant. All of that kind of understanding, I think, pervades this text as a way of doing a kind of nature writing that's very like Texas space. It's very much understands that like the extractive, petrochemical business is the kind of the heart of the essence of the current human landscape of the entire state. And if you don't kind of look at that in the same way as you look at the, remnants of prairie you might find here and there, you're not telling the whole story.
Boy, I could talk about that for a long time. Weston, you were gonna you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about, I mean, there's something really fascinating just in listening to you, and I think this comes across really clearly throughout the book, but you're talking about utopia and dystopia. You're talking about sites that we often overlook or maybe disregard in a particular way, but you're also talking a lot about the really specific kinds of beauty there. And you're writing about that and you're talking about it now, but you've also kind of manifested that in your home. And I think you're doing really interesting work that goes, I mean, bringing in land art, bringing in these different ways of looking at the world around us. That is something that I hear artists speak to frequently. And so I'm curious if, moving from beyond yourself and beyond just the book, which folks can
Yeah.
certainly, if they read it, will get a lot of this. But what do you think for people who are listening? What are strategies they might impart if they wanted to bring some of this kind of new frame to their own lives, or if there are things that you think about if you're interested in rewilding, if you're interested in changing the world around you in some ways? Do you have strategies for others who are inspired by this work?
There's a lot of paths to find there, and it's a very personal thing, and a lot of it has to do with one's own ability and kind of what ability to have to go explore, or what kind of modes of observation work for you. But the first thing I would say is I sometimes joke that not joke that taxonomy is the enemy of wonder,
Mhm. What do
meaning
you mean
that
by that?
meaning that we tend to allow all of our experiences of nature to be mediated by language in a way that is intrinsically alienating. People feel like they don't have standing to enjoy nature if they don't step out into nature with some field guide vernacular knowledge to like interpret the things around them. The information that's in the field guide, it's all based on people who initially went out and had totally unmediated experiences of these objects in nature. And so stepping out and trying to just see in a way that's not about naming the thing or looking it up or looking it up, just like trying to kind of experience the manifestations of nature that are there right around you in your immediate environment. Trying to like figure out strategies to change the way you move through like urban life or suburban life or whatever. Step off the sidewalk and see what you can find, or look for those desire paths that are hidden around the city, see where they take you, and look for those little pockets of woods or that empty lot, and don't be afraid to check it out.
I want to invite you to speak a little bit about what is next up for you in terms of like what you have going on, either like with your, Edgeland house or with your kind of literary career.
Well, at my house, we're going to have to probably redo our green roof next year to try to make it more watertight. So I'm excited to kind of experiment and we live in this kind of evolving seasonal relationship with the land around us, and it's always changing. One of the things we realize is like, oh, of course, this like spot by the river doesn't really want to be a prairie; it wants to be a riparian forest, for crying out loud. And so we're sort of planting trees, and we're very engaged in a lot of kind of activist work involving trying to protect pockets of urban environment in and around Austin, as we have a lot of activity from the Tesla factory to the kind of intense development pressures. And then in terms of my literary work, I'm working right now on a proposal for a new book that's sort of a follow-on to this book. The sort of working title is Zones of Interest, and what I'm trying to do is blend this sort of dystopian nature writing, as it were, mix that with technology criticism and try to like look at some of the like kind of most intense like industrial land uses, like the Tesla factory, like the SpaceX site in Southeast Texas, like these giant data centers that are going online, and looking at them as like nature sites, as nature walk sites, and kind of see what life's around there. And at the same time, look for interesting examples of new species emerging or of threatened or supposedly extinct species that are extant in the landscape, like in Galveston, where you have the so-called ghost wolves, where people thought the red wolf had been exterminated in the wild, and here they've hybridized with like urban coyotes lurking around behind Margaritaville. Or down in San Antonio just a few weeks ago, they found this hybrid of the green jay and the blue jay. The green jay normally never came north of the Rio Grande Valley, and it's like interesting, climate change presumably driven. The scientists won't say go that far in their conclusions, but it seems a reasonable supposition. Strategies for survival and adaptation and cool new species emerging. So thank you all for having me on to talk. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I hope that maybe in your touring of Texas, you can find that chupacabra that you think that maybe exists out there.
I have a piece in the October issue of Texas Highways that's kind of a more detailed version of that sighting. Yeah, so it's available for free online now. Yeah, at that time we saw could have been a chupacabra while driving to go see the Marfa Lights. Go figure. So.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely look that up. Thank you again so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Our next guest, Dr. Rebecca Potts, shifts our focus from the urban lot to the broader mythology of emptiness in Texas. As a postdoctoral associate in environmental humanities at Rice University, Dr. Potts investigates how landscapes are often read as empty or needing to be emptied to create value for specific groups. All right. Well, welcome, Rebecca, to the show. Can you introduce yourself to our listener audience?
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Rebecca Lee Potts. I am currently working as a postdoctoral associate in environmental humanities at Rice, and I'm a lecturer in environmental studies. I just finished my PhD in religious studies from Yale University, and I kind of thinking about land and materiality and what it says about religious and economic values.
So we were just talking with Christopher Brown, who was guiding us through kind of his thinking about these empty spaces, empty lots, finding value in places that are neglected or maybe that we don't see as valuable. And I want to start a little broad with you because I know one of the things you think about a lot is just kind of cultural conceptions of Texas and the West. And I think in the popular cultural imaginary, you know, we think of Texas and like tumbleweeds and cartoons, and like West Texas in particular is this kind of vast emptiness. I mean, we could even talk about Big Bend and, you know, this kind of idea of, you know, what spaces are habitable, what spaces are, you know, just meant to be giant canyons that we can go explore. Can you just talk us through a little bit how you think of emptiness? I mean, in that word on its own, which I think is kind of a loaded term.
Right.
But can you walk us through a little bit what you think of that when you think of Texas, just as a whole? What is this almost mythology of endless empty land in Texas?
Right. Well, what initially drew me to the topic that eventually became my dissertation and why I ended up going out to West Texas is because, you know, I've been going there kind of my whole life, going to summer camp there. My dad works there. My parents currently live out there. And throughout kind of in every single context, be it environmentalists, be it art, be it scientists, be it tourism, I just kept hearing the region described as empty, open. And then when I kind of started doing, you know, in terms of my academic work and, you know, learning more about kind of terra nullius and sort of the role of emptiness in
What was that you said?
terra nullius, like empty land, you know, so that it was empty, it was not being used properly, it was had the potential to be valuable, but it was not currently valuable. And sort of John Locke kind of famous idea is that, you know, that America was empty and that therefore wasted land, but it had the potential. And in order to create valuable property, you had to mix labor with land, and that land sort of on its own had no inherent value, basically. But then it was interesting when I was kind of hearing all of these different formulations of emptiness and openness in West Texas, it wasn't being held as something that was wasteful or that needed to be overcome to create value. Rather, it was the value of that place, and it was the thing that provided the beauty, provided the sort of authenticity, provided, and that had like multiple different valences. For the scientists, you know, it was like the night sky and these dark skies ordinances, and that you got this sort of unmediated relationship with, you know, the stars and the celestial bodies and all these things that we were losing access to in the cities, right? Artists also, like tourism. If you read like Vanity Fair articles, New York Times articles that were being written up about this place, it was always people being like, "Ooh, things can hurt you out in West Texas. Like it's exciting." Like there's just this idea that, and then for environmentalists as well, it was like because another part of West Texas is the Midland Odessa Petroplex, and so this idea that okay, that is like a negative use of land, that actually because it's been so profitable, like that's what we want to preserve against in West Texas. And we want to kind of preserve these open sight lines. We want to preserve Big Bend as a sort of, and so this idea that openness and emptiness, rather than being a waste that needed to be sort of labored upon and made into valuable property, that rather the value in the property was in its emptiness itself.
You said that West Texas was both empty and open. Can you explain for everyone, including myself, what like you see that relationship is between empty and open?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see them as kind of, they're certain lands and certain bodies are being read as empty or needing to be emptied to create sort of the value of openness for certain other people. Think about as the United States had, you know, kind of had taken over the land from Mexico and the land of West Texas, and then we're starting to kind of move in and map it. It was again, repeatedly framed as empty by the United States government, by the surveyors, et cetera. It's like, this is this empty, uninhabited land, but they were also then deploying these like buffalo soldiers and people to come in and kick out the Comanches and Apaches who were living there and who had very much like formed their own kind of nations in that landscape. And so, and one of the things that I find interesting is that the Comanches especially were really able to harness the emptiness, the perceived emptiness of the landscape as a kind of tool in their own kind of political.
How do you mean by that? Like, how are they using that openness?
So being able to, because these areas are seen as like inhospitable, right? They're able to go in and, go in and then like kind of appear sort of seemingly out of, like, this is the way it's sort of described, as appearing out of nowhere and then disappearing very quickly into these landscapes that people at that time were still do see as like uninhabitable, inhospitable. So because this region was seen as like empty and dangerous and sort of a negative valence at this time, they were able to use that emptiness
as an escape,
as like a part of their own political project, as a part of their own kind of relationship.
There's also something really intriguing and Texas is a big place. Like when we think of Texas, there's a lot of different meanings, right? But it's interesting, in talking to Christopher, in my thinking from, a very Houston kind of approach to what Texas is, which is one giant in many ways part of Texas, but also small in other ways. It's fascinating to hear you talk because I think you're totally right. This valuing of that open land, right, which we almost like hear like big sky and kind of thinking about your framing here, that national park mindset of where do we value is so different from a Houston mentality of emptiness where anything that is empty must be occupied. And so there's this interesting tension that I think is playing out as you're talking that I'd love to hear you say more about, between that kind of idea of everywhere must be occupied for land to be valuable versus the value is actually in the lack of occupation of land or the lack of utilization of land.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, because kind of one of the overall sort of theses of my project is looking at how like our religious values, our economic values, our cultural values are not just mapped on, like just sort of mapped onto different landscapes and just remaining the same. Rather, these values are occurring in conversation with the landscape. So it's not to say like, yes, this is an empty landscape and this is a full landscape, because those are ideas, but there is a certain, geographical climate specificity in Houston that is has created certain settlement patterns, histories, ideas, values, and then there's a certain like geographical specificity, climate in West Texas that has then led to other ideas about value and emptiness and occupation and et cetera. And so that those look different because human ideas are being formed through relationships with the environment, just as then the environment is also being altered in sort of conversation and in relationship with these various practices of human value. So it's not one-to-one,
Yeah, well, maybe in a good way of highlighting that is Donald Judd. And so, you were referencing this, and for those who know, Donald Judd, great American artist, landscape artist who was doing land art is really the term, in Marfa, Texas, which has since become this bizarre mecca of global art. I mean, it is an international art destination. City feels like the wrong word.
It is technically a city. It's a city of like 2,000 people.
Okay, I'm going to go on record and say 2,000 people does not constitute a city.
You are going to get in fights with all those Texans from small towns.
And so Marfa, is this fascinating tiny place that has become this real hub. So can you talk to us a little about Marfa, because I think you were going there, and how that place has kind of reshaped our imagination of West Texas.
Right. And so Donald Judd, he kind of first encountered that area when he was going through it for Army service, and like sent a telegram home being like, Mom, it's super no people out here. And then later he was, kind of blowing up the New York art scene and decided that his His cast iron building did not have enough space for the way he wanted to install his art. And he remember, this is sort of the way this is like the mythology of Donald Judd's sort of arrival in Marfa. And so he remembered that there were no people in West Texas. So he came out to West Texas and he was like, this is the perfect place for my art, which we all kind of is called minimalist art. He didn't like that term, but he also very much called the landscape as empty, which is its own sort of version of labeling something minimalist that's like a fraught. So I'm going to just call him minimalist art because he called the landscape empty. So we're just going with it. So he sees it as this sort of uninterrupted grasslands. It also was following a period of intense drought. So a lot of ranches had gone out of business. The region was really struggling. It had been a military base during World War II. It was kind of the height of population in Marfa, but that had all kind of cleared out by the time that Judd arrived on the scene. And so he very much perceived the landscape. So as you say, it's like his big thing was, that art is not representing something. It's not representing a truth. It's not representing a God. It's not representing, some idea. It is the idea. It is the truth in its materials, in its specificity. And so then a part of that sort of materialization of truth is part of the space in which it's inhabited. And so the way that he and the kind of the people who have preserved his legacy out there narrate it is as that Marfa provided this place for it was in itself being an unmediated landscape provided an appropriate space for the unmediated truth of his art. And so one of the things that I'm really doing is demonstrating the sort of mediation, the mediation of emptiness, the sort of mediation of immediacy, which, as you kind of heard me talking about earlier, that is something that appeared again and again and again, is people in all these different industries, people from all these different kind of political, ideological affiliations seem to narrate their relationship with this place as one of unmediated truth.
Can you dig down into that a little more? And I might guide this a bit because I think, and I've written on Martha as well, and I think this is something that we're both seeing. And if you disagree, jump in. But I think what you're getting at here is there's something fascinating to, if we hear the word desert, we do tend to jump to, okay, empty land I can't go to that is of no inherent value because there's no water. And, you can go to any cultural reference you want. I'm going to pick the Mummy because I'm a 90s kid. And, these people don't value gold. These people value water. It's a desert, right? Like that's the kind of mindset we imagine of the desert. And what I think Texas is really interesting is, these landscapes that are often kind of culturally deserts, even just using it in that term of nothing there. Well, the desert might hold oil, which in Texas has real meaning.
Black gold.
And, or the desert might be something I can build land art and I can make into something that we reimagine, re-witness, re-see. And now Marfa is this fascinating tourism hub. Marfa's having to deal with this real kind of issue of what does it mean to grapple with that suddenly in the last few decades, this land taking on a whole new meaning based on the people who are there. As we're imagining these deserts, these landscapes, these emptinesses, I think what you're getting at, am I right, is the way that we invent or see value in different places, which might be oil, it might be I want to build a building there, it might be this could be a tourism hub. There's all these different ways to read that, but I think there's something that you're getting at around emptiness and value and what we choose to value, even that word, offering value or not.
Very much so, yeah. And it's interesting. There's this group called Respect Big Bend that is formed that is funded in large part by the George and Cynthia Mitchell Foundation, who, like George Mitchell, is the father of fracking, and he, and because of the technologies he's developed, Midland, Odessa has had a massive resurgence, and it was kind of on the decline, but now all of that region is able to be really profitable again, and so has very much increased in a certain kind of value. And with the kind of shale fracking revolution, it has sort of made people in this part of West Texas, which Midland, Odessa is part of West Texas, and then the sort of Trans-Pecos, Big Bend area are part of West Texas, but there's very little little to no oil
Hmm.
that they've found or that seem to be there based on geology that I can't explain. But it seems to be unlikely that there is oil in that part of West Texas, although that's what they used to say about the other part. So who knows? But that money is now going into Respect Big Bend, which means, again, trying to preserve these certain forms of non-development, and to preserve these certain forms of emptiness. And there's like a value map, like a literal value map that they created. It's very similar to the Dark Skies map as well. But so it's interesting to me that certain, value is being extracted from one part of West Texas and then injected into this other portion of West Texas to preserve it in its so it's like one part of West Texas's geology is valuable in being able to be sort of taken away and turned into a profit, like in Houston or somewhere else, and then another part of West Texas geography and geology is valuable for staying in place, and that if it was to alter too much, then that would remove its value. And if it did become too inflected by Houston and New York, and that's what's creating its value, but it's also like this constant tension that's coming between, because Marfa and that West Texas is such a it's a beautiful, it's gorgeous. It has this sort of art scene. It's very cultural. Beyonce just bought a house out there. Rick Rubin lives out there. It's got this real cultural cachet, but with that, comes tourism and all these things. So you have this sort of constant sort of struggle over what the value of the place is, what that should look like, what authenticity looks like there. How do you as Judd kind of wanted to preserve the art in its first condition, how do you kind of preserve, what people like about Marfa? And that gets also obviously caught up with questions of water and all these data centers that are coming in and all these things. So it's this kind of, these different value programs are sort of constantly in conflict with each other, and they're each sort of telling each other that they're the thing that makes it more valuable. Like, oh, well, we're bringing jobs. It's like, well, we're preserving the thing that makes it beautiful. It's just this kind of constant give and take, but that is always circling around sort of preservation of this idea of the landscape as empty and open. And I agree that those are importantly different, but I do think that they work together, and that the sort of the emptiness being able to turn into openness is what potentially separates it from the emptiness turned into like labor and development and extraction versus the emptiness turned into openness, which is what makes it valuable in that particular landscape and set of conditions.
So I might bring us roundabout back to some of the things that we talked about with Christopher Brown. And one of the things that I found kind of fascinating about that conversation is his kind of interest and I think critique of bringing land back to its quote unquote like natural state, in like a critique of that kind of what's the word I'm looking for, like authenticity of like what it means to be like a natural place,
right? And
so I heard you talk a little bit about that and relationship to like unmediated, right? And I think his critique is that there is no unmediated land anymore when it comes to humans, that all land now is really kind of been touched by humankind and the kind of impact we can have. And it's more of a matter of, instead of trying to return to the specific kind of like pre-human contact land, whatever that could look like,
right?
It's more about like, well, how do we live in consideration of the land that we currently live and the life that exists there today. So I just want to open up, that conversation for you.
Right. I very much agree with that. I agree with that, and I would potentially maybe even push it farther in the like, how do we think not of this thing isn't mediated just because humans have been here? Technology as not just something that is human, and that like thought and the ability to kind of perceive the world and mediate the world is not exclusive to humans.
There's something I'd like to pick your brain on around going back a little bit, and it's something we've talked about before. And in some of this conversation around how we view emptiness is a different component, which is time.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring that up specifically because, we're talking about Big Bend, we're talking about West Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm thinking about Houston. And I want to bring
Yeah.
a little bit back to Houston. And, we've covered a couple different ways that we think about value and that people ascribe value or determine, and arguments around this kind of valuing of emptiness. But I think one of the things, there's something interesting to like West Texas landscapes, which in a way feel much more eternal, right? If we think of Big Bend, it feels unchanging. It feels, which is not to say that it doesn't change over time, but it's just not a time scale that humans generally operate on. We're thinking about thousands of years or more. Houston, our landscape is not mountains, it's not canyons, it's not rocks, it's prairie. And prairie operates on a much faster visual time scale, right? We have points of the year where things die down and it feels empty in a different way. We have points of the year where prairie is, in full bloom and it's, completely alive, and we understand that. How much is time a component here? How much is the idea of something eternal, unchanging, linked to how we're viewing value? Because part of, I think, your point with Marfa and Judd is, this is framing a landscape he imagined as pretty ongoing, that you're seeing different sunsets, but like it's the same kind of landscape. And that there's something of, trying to highlight those micro differences. Whereas I think when we look at somewhere like Houston and we see emptiness, we see weeds, we don't see prairie. And there's something interesting in how we've chosen to value those landscapes.
Yeah. I mean, prairies are interesting. There's this great I don't know if great's the word, but there's this 1928 movie called The Wind. It's one of the last silent
Dorothy
movies.
Scarborough is the writer.
It's about, people coming in to, it's about West Texas, and it's like in Sweetwater, and this woman from, the lush Virginia is like used to this kind of more like, East Texas-y. I mean, it's like southern, swampy kind of landscape. And then she comes to West Texas on the train, and all of a sudden it's, this open prairie of wind, and it's horrible, and she's hates it, and then there's tornadoes, and she gets driven insane by the wind and also the patriarchy, because everyone's like pawing at her when she gets out there. But the way that it starts and the way that it ends is about sort of the taming of the sort of importance of taming of the land. So this wind is sort of this thing that initially is this sort of value destroy, like it's literally destroying the church. It's destroying her marriage. It's destroying her sort of will to live. It's destroying her, like it's destroying everything. But then there's this villain, and she kills him, and the wind covers him up. And then her husband, who she's been estranged from because she's been going crazy because she hates the wind so much, comes in and is like, if you kill a man in justice, it always covers him up. And then they like unite in wedded bliss. Like just like the wind is no longer this like terrifying, value destroying thing. Now it's the thing. Now it's the thing that will like ensure their place within the landscape, and that they will now like be able, this like Protestant work ethic and like heterosexual domesticity is like has triumphed over the precarities of the landscape, and now has like, instead of them being counter to, is now on the side of the sort of colonial
there also sounds
projects.
like it's just a narrative of fighting against nature rather than coming to terms with nature and working with.
But the wind covers the body up, right? So it's like the wind becomes part on her side,
Yeah.
right? So it's like it becomes harnessed in a particular way, which you can think of like wind farms, right? It's like, okay, it's like the wind goes from being this thing that is counter to property regimes to being something that can be harnessed on the side of property. And I think that change is really interesting. There's this poem from like probably around the time that this movie came out that's like, it's dusty out here in West Texas, in the land where the breezes blow and the ranches go by in handfuls. Where they come from, you never know. And then it ends with like, we must love this country, we have to eat it, So it goes again. You can see like the way that the wind is doing is taking the ranches away and, kind of destroying property in this way, and that we have to eat it and it's coming inside of our bodies, to then becoming this thing that is rather making the land more valuable, making it in terms of wind farms. You don't notice the wind, you don't notice the air unless it's a problem. Right. And so then the ways that the air, in sort of not being a problem, mediates the land in a certain way, and then the air becoming a problem is mediating the emptiness in a different way. And the ways that those, and then those interactions are then creating different landscapes. Like now you have wind farms, and if the air was acting differently, that would all look differently, and our relationship with the landscape would look different.
Dr. Rebecca Potts, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anywhere through our podcast, available on all major platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio, produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean, provided by Sarah Tabrez and Endara Varma. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.